I stared at the non-disclosure agreement on the mahogany desk, my hand trembling, not from fear, but from the effort it took not to smile. "Sign it, Vera," my husband Marcus said, his voice dripping with the false patience of a man who thought he'd already won. "Sign it, and we can all move past this unfortunate misunderstanding." Misunderstanding, that's what he was calling it. The systematic embezzlement of my family's pharmaceutical company. The affair with my stepsister, Catherine. The forged documents that made it look like I was the one stealing. The coordinated campaign to have me declared mentally incompetent. And, in my previous life, the accidental fall down the stairs that had killed me 3 weeks from now. But Marcus didn't know I'd already lived through all of this once. He didn't know that I'd woken up 6 months in the past, the morning after my father's funeral, with every memory of my destruction intact. He didn't know that the confused, grieving widow he thought he was manipulating was actually a woman who'd spent her death watching from some impossible place as he and Catherine had laughed over my corpse. I could still hear their voices from that night, the night after my funeral when I'd somehow been conscious but trapped, unable to move or speak, just aware. They'd thought they were alone in my father's study, the study that was now legally Marcus's, along with everything else. "I can't believe she actually fell for it," Catherine had said, pouring herself a drink from my father's private collection. All those years of playing the devoted stepsister, and she never suspected a thing. Marcus had laughed. She was too trusting, too naive. She actually thought people were good at heart. That made her weak. And you marrying her, that was the masterstroke. She fell so hard for you, Marcus. She never stopped to wonder why a man like you would want a woman like her. A woman like her with a company like her father's, you mean? They'd laughed together, they'd toasted to their success, they'd planned out how they'd spend my inheritance, how they'd restructure the company, who they'd push out of the board. And I'd listened, helpless as my existence faded into whatever came next. Until suddenly I was gasping awake in my childhood bedroom, in the bed I'd slept in the night of my father's funeral, with the morning light streaming through windows I'd watched, become distant and dark as my life ended. I'd stumbled to my bathroom and vomited, not from sickness, but from the sheer impossibility of it. I was alive. I was 6 months in the past. And I remembered everything, every lie, every manipulation, every moment they'd made me doubt my own sanity. And this time, I was going to make sure they paid for it. But not the way I'd tried before. In my first life, in those final 3 weeks before they'd killed me, I'd fought openly. I'd accused Marcus at a board meeting. I'd confronted Catherine in front of our parents' friends. I'd gone to the police with my suspicions, to lawyers with my concerns, to anyone who would listen, and they'd destroyed me for it. Every accusation had been turned into evidence of my mental breakdown. Every piece of proof I'd tried to present had been misinterpreted or taken out of context. The psychiatric evaluation Marcus had arranged, one I'd gone to willingly, desperately trying to prove I wasn't crazy, had been twisted into a diagnosis of paranoid delusions and persecution complex. The doctor had been on their payroll. I'd learned that too late. So this time, I'd been quiet. I'd played the grieving daughter, the confused widow, the woman who just needed time to process her father's death. I'd let them think they were winning while I documented everything. Every bank statement I could access, every email I could recover, every conversation I could record. For 6 months, I'd been the perfect victim while building an unassailable case. And now they thought they'd won. They thought this NDA was the final nail in my coffin, the legal document that would keep me silent forever while they consolidated their control over everything my father had built. They had no idea they were about to hand me the key to their destruction. "The terms are simple," Catherine added from her position by the window, examining her manicured nails. She wore black, still in mourning for my father, the man she'd been sleeping with, Marcus, behind both our backs. That had been a revelation from my first life, too, discovered through some of my father's private correspondence. Catherine had been angling for a direct inheritance, sleeping with my father in his final years, probably planning to frame me for something to get written out of the will entirely. When that hadn't worked, my father had been clear that the company would go to me, his biological daughter. She'd pivoted to the embezzlement scheme with Marcus. You don't talk about the financial discrepancies, Catherine continued. You don't make accusations about anyone in the family or the company. You don't publish information, don't make statements to the press, don't discuss these matters with anyone outside your immediate legal counsel. In exchange, we don't press charges for the embezzlement and don't initiate proceedings to have you declared incompetent. My stepmother, Linda, sat in the corner, silent as always. She'd never been the villain in a direct way, just a coward who'd chosen comfort over defending me. In my first life, she testified at the competency hearing that I'd been increasingly unstable and saying troubling things. She'd cried while doing it, probably believing she was helping somehow, but it hadn't mattered. Her testimony had been damning because she was my family, and family wouldn't lie about such serious concerns. This time, I'd barely spoken to her since the funeral. Every interaction had been recorded, and every recording showed me being calm, rational, and appropriately grieving. She'd have nothing to testify to. Marcus leaned forward, his hands clasped on the desk. His wedding ring caught the light, the ring I'd bought him with my own money, a custom design from a jeweler in Milan. Vera, I know this has been hard. Losing your father, discovering the financial problems, dealing with the stress of it all. We're trying to make this as easy as possible for you. The settlement we're offering is generous. $2 million, a full release from any company obligations, and a clean slate. You can start over somewhere quiet, somewhere without all this pressure. Somewhere isolated, he meant. Somewhere I couldn't cause problems. In my first life, they'd suggested the same thing, a rest at a private facility in upstate New York. I'd been there for 2 weeks before I'd realized it was a psychiatric hospital, and by then, they'd already begun the competency proceedings. I wouldn't be going anywhere this time. I picked up the pen, watching their postures relax. This was the moment they'd been working toward for years, the moment when the troublesome heiress finally accepted her fate. There's one addition I need, I said softly, my voice that of a broken woman asking for one small dignity. A clause stating that Vera Chen specifically cannot speak about these matters. That Vera Chen is bound to silence regarding any and all business dealings, personal matters, or accusations related to Marcus Chen, Catherine Chen, and the Chen Bradford Pharmaceutical Corporation. The room went quiet. I could see them processing, trying to figure out the angle. Marcus's eyes narrowed slightly. He wasn't stupid, just arrogant. He was wondering if this was a trap. Catherine spoke first. Why would you want that specific wording? I let my voice shake. Because I don't want there to be any ambiguity. I don't want to accidentally violate the agreement and lose everything. If it specifically says that I, Vera Chen, cannot speak about these things, then I know exactly what the boundaries are. I'm not a lawyer. I need it to be clear. It was the perfect explanation. The scared woman seeking clarity, trying to protect herself by making the restrictions explicit. They saw weakness where there was calculation. Marcus and Catherine exchanged glances. I watched the silent communication between them, the way Catherine's eyebrow rose slightly, the way Marcus gave an almost imperceptible nod. They thought I was having a breakdown, that I was so beaten down I was trying to protect myself by making the terms even more specific and restrictive. That's actually more favorable to us, Catherine said slowly, straightening from the window. Marcus, if we specify Vera Chen by name throughout the document, it becomes ironclad. She can't claim later that the terms were unclear or that she didn't understand what she was agreeing to. My husband smiled that smile that had once made my heart race. Now I knew it for what it was, a predator's grin, the expression of someone who'd successfully cornered their prey. Draw up the addendum. Make it ironclad. I want Vera Chen in there as many times as legally necessary. Make it so she can't even whisper our names without violating the agreement. I'll call Davidson, Catherine said, pulling out her phone. He can be here in 20 minutes. Richard Davidson was their lawyer, a man who specialized in making problems disappear for wealthy families. In my first life, he'd been the one to oversee my committal proceedings. He was very good at what he did, which made him dangerous. But he was also meticulous, and meticulous meant he'd do exactly what they asked. He'd write an NDA that bound Vera Chen so thoroughly that not even the most creative lawyer could find a loophole. Unless, of course, the loophole was that Vera Chen wasn't the one who needed to speak. Davidson arrived with his leather briefcase and his air of professional discretion. He listened to Marcus and Catherine explain what they wanted, took notes on his legal pad, and began drafting the addendum on his laptop. I sat quietly, playing with my teacup, the picture of a defeated woman waiting for her cage to be finalized. The key, Davidson said, his fingers flying across the keyboard, is repetition and specificity. Every clause should specify that it is Vera Chen, identified by full legal name and date of birth, who is bound. Will include her signature and her explicit acknowledgement that she understands these terms apply specifically to her. What about maiden name? Catherine asked. She was Vera Bradford before she married Marcus. Good point. We'll note that these restrictions apply to Vera Chen, née Bradford, and any future legal names she may adopt. That covers her if she divorces Marcus and takes back her maiden name or remarries. I almost laughed. They were so thorough in binding me that they were binding a specific legal identity, the identity of Vera Chen and all variations thereof. They were creating the most restrictive NDA possible, one that would follow me through name changes and years and any attempt to speak. Perfect. An hour later, the document was ready. 8 pages of dense legal text with my full name, Vera Chen, née Bradford, born April 15, 1988, appearing no less than 47 times. Every restriction, every prohibition, every requirement for silence was attributed specifically to me by name. Vera Chen cannot disclose. Vera Chen shall not publish. Vera Chen agrees not to make statements. Vera Chen is prohibited from discussing. Vera Chen acknowledges that any violation. Vera Chen understands and agrees. Over and over, my name, binding me to silence. Initial each page, Davidson instructed, sliding the document across the desk. And sign and date the final page. All witness, along with Mr. Chen and Ms. Chen. I initialed. Page by page, I marked my agreement to terms that would haunt Marcus and Catherine for the rest of their lives, though they didn't know it yet. When I signed the final page, my hand was steady. Marcus witnessed, his signature bold and confident. Catherine witnessed, dotting her I's with little circles like she had since she was 16. Davidson notarized with his official stamp. Congratulations, Davidson said, though it wasn't clear who he was congratulating. The agreement is now binding. Ms. Chen, Vera, you are legally obligated to maintain silence regarding all matters specified herein. Any violation will result in the forfeiture of your settlement and potential legal action for breach of contract. I understand, I said softly. They had no idea how much I understood. Marcus pulled out a checkbook, old-fashioned, but he liked the symbolism of physically writing large checks, and filled one out for $2 million. My money, technically, but I'd never point that out to them. He handed it to me with a look that might have been pity if he were capable of genuine emotion. I hope you find peace, Vera, he said. I really do. I took the check and folded it carefully. Thank you, Marcus, for everything. The irony was apparently lost on him. I walked out of that office with the check in my purse and the NDA in my briefcase. I drove carefully. My hands were shaking now, but with adrenaline, not fear. I'd done it. I'd gotten them to create the perfect protection for what I was about to do. My phone buzzed with a text from Marcus. Are you okay? I know that was hard. I'm here if you need to talk. I deleted it without responding. Marcus Chen, the concerned husband, worried about his traumatized wife. It was a good act. In my first life, it had convinced everyone who mattered. Not this time. I drove straight to my storage unit, the one I'd rented the morning after I'd woken up 6 months ago, the one listed under my mother's maiden name, Lydia Morrison. The unit was small, climate-controlled, and anonymous, perfect for what I'd been hoarding. Inside were 6 months of meticulous documentation, organized in file boxes that would make a forensic accountant weep with joy. Box 1. Financial records. Bank statements I'd photographed during loving wife dinners at home when Marcus would leave his laptop open and his guard down. Screenshots of offshore accounts I'd discovered through his email. Wire transfer confirmations I'd found in his desk drawer when he thought I was at yoga. Records of shell companies, LLCs registered in Delaware with names like Sterling Medical Consulting and Bradford Advisory Group. that funneled money out of the company and into accounts Marcus and Catherine controlled. Box 2, digital communications. Emails I'd recovered from Marcus's deleted folders using recovery software. Text messages I'd extracted from his phone backup when he'd asked me to update his apps and had to give me his passcode. Signal and WhatsApp conversations I'd screenshotted by setting up Banitya's mirror of his phone on an old tablet. Slack messages from the company's internal system that I still had access to as a board member, access they'd forgotten to revoke. The communications were damning. Marcus and Catherine discussing the embezzlement in detail. Catherine bragging about how easily she'd forged my signature. Marcus strategizing about how to isolate me from my father during his final illness. One email chain in particular stood out. From 3 years ago when they'd first started planning, Marcus to Catherine. She trusts me completely. I could tell her the sky was green and she'd believe me. That's our advantage. Catherine to Marcus. Her father's the problem. He dotes on her. We need to create distance there, make him doubt her judgment. Marcus to Catherine. Leave that to me. I'll start suggesting she's been forgetful, making small mistakes. By the time he's really sick, he'll already be primed to believe she's unreliable. And they'd done it. For 3 years, Marcus had been undermining me to my father. Little comments, carefully placed. Vera seemed confused about the board meeting dates. Vera couldn't remember the name of that investor. Vera's been very emotional lately. Nothing dramatic enough to raise alarms, but enough to plant seeds of doubt. By the time my father had gotten his diagnosis, pancreatic cancer, stage 4, caught too late, he'd already been half convinced that I wasn't capable of running the company alone, that I'd need support, that Marcus, his trusted son-in-law, should have more authority. Box 3, the forgeries. This was the evidence I was most proud of. I'd suspected Catherine was forging documents but hadn't been able to prove it in my first life. This time, I'd been ready. I'd set up a nanny cam in Marcus's home office, ostensibly to catch the mice problem we'd been having, complete with fake droppings I'd placed strategically. The camera had been positioned to watch the desk, and I'd waited. Sure enough, 2 months ago, Catherine had come over when she thought I was at my grief counseling appointment, an appointment Marcus had suggested I attend, naturally. I'd skipped it and parked down the street, watching from my car as Catherine had let herself in with the spare key. The footage was beautiful. Catherine at the desk, practicing my signature. She had samples, old documents I'd signed, copies she'd made over the years. She'd practice on scrap paper, trying to match my loops and flourishes. Then she'd carefully forge my signature on withdrawal authorizations, transfer forms, approval documents. The documents themselves were in the box too. I'd stolen them back, replacing them with identical forgeries of the forgeries, using the signature samples Catherine thought she'd hidden. The originals were here, complete with Catherine's fingerprints, DNA from the envelope seal she'd licked, and metadata showing they'd been created on her computer. Box 4, the psychiatric fraud. This was personal. Dr. Harrison Weiss, the psychiatrist Marcus had sent me to in my first life, had been thorough in his diagnosis of my paranoid delusions. In this life, I'd gone to see him anyway, but I'd been prepared. I'd worn a wire. Every session for 6 weeks, I'd recorded our conversations. And I'd been the perfect patient. Calm, rational, discussing my grief over my father's death in healthy terms. Absolutely no paranoia, no delusions, no signs of mental illness beyond normal bereavement. But I'd also done my research. Dr. Weiss had received a $50,000 consulting fee from Marcus right before my first appointment. The payment had been laundered through one of the shell companies, but I'd traced it. I had the bank records showing the payment going out from Marcus's account to Sterling Medical Consulting, and then a check from Dr. Weiss's business account depositing almost exactly the same amount a week later. I'd documented the whole scheme, and in our final session, I'd asked Dr. Weiss directly, "Do you think I'm mentally competent?" His answer, recorded, "Absolutely. You're processing grief in a healthy way. You're rational, coherent, and have good insight into your emotional state. I see no signs of any psychiatric disorder." That recording contradicted everything he'd testified to in my first life. And with the financial connection established, it would destroy his credibility if they tried the same thing again. Box 5, the attempted murder. This was the most crucial evidence and the hardest to obtain. In my first life, I'd died falling down the stairs. It had been ruled an accident. I'd been distraught. It was late at night. The carpet had been loose. Just a tragic mishap, but I remembered. The carpet hadn't been loose that morning. I'd walked down those stairs a dozen times that day. It had only been loose that night when I'd heard a sound from my father's study and rushed down to investigate. This time, I'd been paranoid. I'd set up security cameras throughout the house, hidden in smoke detectors and picture frames. Cameras Marcus didn't know about, recording everything. And sure enough, 3 days ago, exactly 3 weeks before the date I'd died in my first life, I'd caught Marcus on camera. He'd been in the hallway kneeling by the stairs. He'd carefully loosened the carpet runner, pulling the tacks just enough that they'd catch a foot, but not enough to be obvious in daylight. He'd tested it, pressing down with his hand, making sure it would slip. Then he'd sent me a text. "Did you hear something downstairs? Might want to check the study. Sounded like breaking glass." In my first life, I'd gotten that text. I'd rushed downstairs in the dark. The carpet had caught my foot. I'd fallen, and the fall had killed me. This time, I'd seen the text and frozen. I'd pulled up the security footage on my phone and watched in real time as Marcus stood at the bottom of the stairs, waiting to hear me fall, waiting to become a widower who would inherit everything. I'd stayed in my room. After an hour, he'd come upstairs, checking on me, acting concerned that I hadn't investigated the noise. I'd told him I'd taken a sleeping pill and hadn't heard his text come through. He'd been frustrated. I could see it in the tightness around his eyes. The next morning, I'd noticed the carpet had been fixed. He couldn't leave it obviously tampered with, not when I hadn't taken the bait, but I had the footage. I had every second of his attempted murder recorded in high definition. Box 6. Everything else. Testimony I'd secretly recorded from people who'd been involved in various ways. My father's former assistant, Grace Lynn, who'd been paid $75,000 to keep quiet about the suspicious documents she'd processed in the weeks before my father's death. Grace had a conscience, though. She'd cracked when I'd shown up at her door with evidence that their payout check had bounced. She'd given me a deposition, recorded and notarized, explaining everything she'd seen. Medical records I'd obtained showing the pain medication my father had been prescribed in his final months. Medication that had been filled but never administered, while my father had suffered in agony. Because Catherine had been controlling his care, and a father in pain was easier to manipulate than one thinking clearly. Social media posts I'd archived from Catherine's friends discussing her new guy and her amazing apartment and her investment success, all posted during the time she was supposedly grieving and struggling financially right alongside me. Character witnesses who remembered conversations where Marcus had said suspicious things. Colleagues my father had trusted who'd noticed the way Marcus pushed me out of meetings, and Catherine always had an explanation for why I couldn't be reached. It was all here. 6 months of work. 6 months of pretending to be the victim they thought I was while actually being the investigator they never suspected. And now I had the last piece. The NDA that specifically bound Vera Chen to silence. Vera Chen couldn't speak about any of this, but I wasn't planning to speak, I was planning to write. And I wasn't planning to do it as Vera Chen. I discovered my mother's pen name by accident in my first life, going through her things in that strange liminal space after my death. Lydia Bradford, my brilliant creative mother, who had died when I was 12, had been a mystery writer before she'd married into pharmaceutical wealth. She'd published 6 novels under the name V.L. Morrison, dark, twisty thrillers about women who solved crimes the police couldn't or wouldn't handle. I'd loved those books growing up, never knowing my mother had written them. She'd kept her writing life separate. She'd explained in a letter I'd found after her death. The Bradford name came with expectations and judgments. As V.L. Morrison, she could write freely, without pressure or influence. The pen name had been maintained through a literary trust, one that was set to pass to me on my 30th birthday. In my first life, I'd turned 30 1 week after my funeral. The trust had dissolved, the pen name had been retired, and my mother's legacy had ended. This time, I'd turned 30 3 weeks ago. The trust had transferred to me automatically. I now owned the rights to all of V.L. Morrison's work and, more importantly, the right to publish new work under that name. I'd contacted the trust attorney immediately, a kind older woman named Margaret Rothstein who'd worked with my mother decades ago. She'd been delighted to hear from me. "Your mother always hoped you'd want to continue her work," Margaret had said. "She left notes, ideas for future books. She made me promise to give them to you if you ever activated the trust." Those notes had been revelatory. My mother had been working on a new novel when she died, a corporate thriller about a woman who discovers her husband is embezzling from her family's company. She'd been researching pharmaceutical fraud, corporate law, and how to hide money in offshore accounts. My mother had known. Maybe not about Marcus specifically. He'd come into my life years after her death, but she'd known about the vulnerabilities in our company, the ways someone could exploit family trust for financial gain. She'd been trying to warn me through fiction. I'd cried when I'd read her notes, not from grief, though that was there too, but from the overwhelming sense that my mother was reaching across death to help me. She'd given me the tools I needed, a pen name with no legal connection to Vera Chen, a literary legacy I could leverage, and a publisher who'd be thrilled to see V.L. Morrison return. And return she would. I spent the next 3 months writing, not in my apartment where Marcus might drop by unexpectedly to check on me, not anywhere connected to my old life. Instead, I rented a small studio in a neighborhood I'd never frequented, paying cash for 6 months up front. I told the landlord I was a writer working on a book. It was true enough. The studio became my sanctuary. One room with hardwood floors, tall windows, and enough space for a desk, a chair, and a futon. I bought a laptop with cash, using an email address not connected to any of my other accounts. I set up the space with everything I needed: printer, filing cabinets for my evidence, a coffee maker for the long nights. And I wrote. The book poured out of me like poison being drained from a wound. Every manipulation Marcus had pulled became a scene. Every lie Catherine had told became dialogue. Every moment I doubted my own sanity became the protagonist's internal struggle. I called it The Inheritance, and I changed just enough to call it fiction. The protagonist was Victoria Sterling, not Vera Chen. The company manufactured medical devices, not pharmaceuticals. The husband's name was Michael. The stepsister was Christine. The city was Chicago, not Boston. Physical descriptions were different. Surface details were altered. But the bones of the story, the emotional truth, the methods of manipulation, the financial fraud, that was all real. I wrote the opening scene. Victoria at her father's funeral, her husband Michael's hand on her shoulder in a gesture that looked supportive but felt possessive. Her stepsister Christine crying theatrically, drawing sympathetic looks from the mourners. Victoria's sense that something was wrong, even as everyone told her she was just grieving. I wrote the escalation. Michael suggesting Victoria was forgetful. Christine taking over more of the company's day-to-day operations. The board meetings where Victoria's ideas were dismissed, her concerns labeled as paranoia. The financial discrepancies she noticed but couldn't prove. The way Michael kept suggesting she rest, that she was under too much stress. I wrote the gaslighting, Michael moving Victoria's keys and then helping her find them, shaking his head sadly. Christine mentioning conversations that had never happened. The psychiatrist who seemed helpful but submitted reports suggesting Victoria was delusional. The isolation as friends and colleagues began to doubt her. I wrote the discovery, Victoria finding the emails, uncovering the shell companies, realizing her signature had been forged, understanding that her husband and stepsister weren't just stealing from her, they were trying to destroy her credibility so thoroughly that no one would believe her when she fought back. And I wrote the revenge. But I didn't write it as a fantasy. I wrote it as a blueprint, using every piece of evidence I'd gathered as the foundation for the protagonist's counterattack. Victoria's methods were my methods. Her evidence was my evidence, disguised just enough to be fictional. The bank transaction numbers in the book? Real numbers, with a few digits changed, enough that a forensic accountant could reverse engineer the actual accounts. The dates of key events? Actual dates, shifted by a few weeks. Close enough that investigators could match them to real events in Chen Bradford Pharma's history. The legal documents Victoria discovered? Word-for-word copies of documents I'd found, with names redacted and replaced. But the structure, the language, the specific legal clauses, all real. I wrote a thriller that was simultaneously a confession, an accusation, and an evidence dump. Every chapter advanced the plot while also carefully documenting how corporate fraud actually worked. Readers would think I was just being detailed in my research. Investigators would recognize a roadmap. The climax of the book was Victoria's elaborate plan to expose Michael and Christine, not through direct confrontation, but through forcing them to expose themselves. She signed an NDA, one that specifically bound Victoria Sterling to silence. And then she published everything under a pseudonym they'd never thought to prohibit. It was wish fulfillment, yes. But it was also exactly what I was about to do. I wrote for 12 hours a day, fueled by coffee and righteous anger. The words came easily because I'd lived them. Every emotion Victoria felt, I'd felt. Every betrayal she endured, I'd endured. Every moment of doubt and fear and desperate hope, all of it was real. 3 months later, I had a manuscript, 347 pages, 94,000 words, single-spaced. A complete novel that was simultaneously a thriller and a true crime confession. I read through it once, correcting typos and tightening prose. Then I packaged it up and sent it to my mother's old publisher. The query letter was simple. Dear Ms. Rodriguez, 20 years ago, you published 6 mystery novels by V.L. Morrison. I'm writing to let you know that Morrison has completed a new novel and would like to offer it to you first, in honor of your long relationship with the author. The Inheritance is a corporate thriller about financial fraud, family betrayal, and a woman's fight to reclaim what was stolen from her. It's Morrison's most personal work, a book that could only be written by someone who truly understands the intimate nature of betrayal. I've attached the full manuscript for your review. Morrison is prepared to discuss publication at your earliest convenience. Sincerely, Margaret Rothstein, Literary Trust Attorney for V.L. Morrison. I'd looped Margaret into the plan by then. She'd been skeptical at first. Publishing under my mother's name felt like a big responsibility, she'd said. But when I'd explained the situation, carefully, without admitting to anything that would make her an accessory, she'd understood. Your mother would be proud, she'd said simply. She always believed the best revenge was living well, but I think she'd make an exception for this. The response from the publisher came within a week. Elena Rodriguez, the editor who'd worked with my mother, called Margaret directly as I need to speak with Morrison. This book, it's extraordinary. It's been 20 years since the last publication, and this reads like it was worth every day of that wait, but I need to understand the author's intent. This book is going to cause shockwaves. Margaret had smiled when she relayed the conversation. I think that means she wants to publish it. We set up a call. I used a voice modulator, easily purchased online, to disguise my voice. I told Elena Rodriguez that V.L. Morrison had always been reclusive and intended to remain so, that the book was deeply personal and that Morrison had no interest in publicity or press tours. The work speaks for itself, I said, my voice distorted into something unrecognizable. Morrison wants this story told, but Morrison doesn't want to become the story. Elena had paused. Then, I can work with that. In fact, the mystery might help sales. The reclusive author returns with a bombshells book. That's a narrative we can sell. She'd offered a 2-book contract, $250,000 advance, split between The Inheritance and 1 additional novel to be delivered within 2 years. The money would go to the Literary Trust, which would then distribute it to me as the trust's beneficiary, a completely legal process with no direct connection to Vera Chen's finances. I'd accepted. One more thing, Elena had said. This book is going to need legal review. The level of detail about corporate fraud, our lawyers will want to make sure we were protected. If anyone claims this is based on real events, we need to be able to defend it as fiction. That won't be a problem, I'd assured her. Morrison has done extensive research. Everything in the book is either publicly available information or sufficiently fictionalized. No one can claim defamation when the characters are clearly fictional and any resemblance to real persons is purely coincidental. It was a careful dance. The book was close enough to truth to be recognizable to anyone who knew the players. But it was distant enough from literal fact that Marcus and Catherine couldn't sue without admitting they were the models for the criminal characters. The legal review took 2 months. The publisher's lawyers read every page, fact-checked every financial detail, and concluded that while the book was remarkably well-researched, it was defensible as fiction. They had no idea they were right on both counts. The Inheritance was scheduled for publication 6 months from the contract signing. That gave me time for the next phase of my plan. I couldn't just publish the book and hope for the best. I needed to ensure people would pay attention, that the right people would see the connections, that investigators would be motivated to look deeper. So I started seeding the ground. First, I became active on social media as an anonymous account focused on corporate fraud. I called myself at corporate watchdog and I posted about pharmaceutical company scandals, embezzlement cases, and the ways wealthy families used their power to cover up crimes. I built a following slowly, a few hundred followers at first, then a few thousand. I never mentioned my own case. I kept everything general, educational. I shared news articles about other companies, other frauds. I became known as a reliable source for corporate malfeasance information. Then I started a blog, still anonymous, still general. The Dark Side of Corporate America was my title, and I wrote long-form pieces about specific fraud cases, breaking down how they worked, why they succeeded, and how they were eventually uncovered. One article was about family-owned pharmaceutical companies and their unique vulnerabilities. I discussed how trust could be weaponized, how insider positions made fraud easier, how generational wealth often meant less oversight. I didn't mention Chen Bradford Pharma by name, but anyone who knew the company would recognize the patterns. Another article was about psychiatric fraud, the way powerful people could use mental health diagnoses to discredit victims. I detailed several cases where wealthy spouses had had their partners declared incompetent, cited specific tactics, explained how the legal system could be manipulated. Again, no specific names. But the methods I described were exactly the methods Marcus and Catherine had used. I was creating a context, building a narrative framework that would make the inheritance land with maximum impact. When the book came out, people would already be primed to think about corporate fraud and family betrayal. The book wouldn't come out of nowhere. It would slot into an existing conversation I'd been carefully cultivating. I also reached out to journalists, still anonymously, tipping them to interesting corporate fraud stories. Not my own story, not yet. But similar cases. I became a source, someone who understood these issues and could point reporters in interesting directions. One journalist in particular, Samantha Cho from the Boston Herald, became a regular contact. She was smart, tenacious, and passionate about exposing corporate corruption. We developed a rapport through encrypted email. "Why do you do this?" she asked me once. "You clearly have inside knowledge of how these systems work. Were you a victim of something similar?" I'd been careful in my response. Let's just say I believe the truth matters, and sometimes the truth needs help getting out. She'd respected that, and I knew that when the inheritance published, Samantha would be one of the first people to notice the parallels to Chen Bradford Pharma. I was building an army of truth-tellers, all unknowingly preparing for my book to drop like a bomb into the conversation. Marcus and Catherine, meanwhile, were thriving. The NDA had done exactly what they'd wanted, silenced me completely. I'd disappeared from company functions, from board meetings, from Boston's social circles. As far as anyone knew, I was living quietly somewhere, using my settlement to start over. Marcus had moved into my father's mansion, the one where I'd grown up. He'd redecorated, removing my mother's touches, bringing in an interior designer who favored cold, modern aesthetics. Catherine had moved into the guest house on the property, ostensibly to help Marcus manage the estate. They weren't even hiding their affair anymore. Photos of them at charity galas, Marcus's hand on Catherine's waist, articles in Boston Magazine about the new power couple behind Chen Bradford Pharma. They'd waited a respectable 6 months after our separation to go public, but now they were everywhere together. The company, meanwhile, was changing. My father had built Chen Bradford Pharma on a foundation of ethical research and quality control. Slow growth, but sustainable. Medications that worked, trials that weren't rushed, safety standards that exceeded federal requirements. Marcus and Catherine had different priorities. Under their leadership, the company pivoted toward faster drug development, looser trial protocols, and aggressive lobbying for reduced regulations. Stock prices went up, shareholders loved the new direction, but safety complaints started trickling in. Adverse effect reports that were downplayed or hidden, quality control issues that were swept under the rug. I documented all of it. Every news article, every press release, every public statement about their commitment to innovation and streamlined processes. I saved screenshots of stock prices, archived internal memos that got leaked to the press, kept track of every corner they cut. All of it would be relevant soon. The board had been restructured too. My father's old friends and colleagues, the ones who'd built the company alongside him, had been systematically pushed out. Some had taken generous retirement packages, some had been forced out through hostile board votes, a few had objected publicly and been threatened with lawsuits. By the time my book was set to publish, the board was entirely composed of Marcus and Catherine's people. Young, ambitious executives who cared more about profit margins than patient safety. Investors who measured success in quarterly earnings, not long-term sustainability. My father's legacy was being destroyed from within, and everyone thought it was progress. I watched it happen with cold satisfaction, because every change they made, every ethical compromise they accepted, every corner they cut, all of it was evidence. All of it proved that the people running Chen Bradford Pharma were exactly the kind of people who would embezzle and forge documents and try to have someone killed. By the time the inheritance revealed who they really were, the ground would already be prepared. People would look at the company's new direction and think, of course they're corrupt. Look at what they've done. 3 weeks before publication, advance reader copies went out. This is standard in publishing. Early copies sent to reviewers, booksellers, book bloggers, anyone who might generate buzz for the book. Our keys aren't the final version. They're marked clearly as advance copies, not for sale. But they get the book into the hands of people who can create momentum before official release. Elena Rodriguez sent me, through Margaret, of course, a list of everyone who'd receive an RC. 300 copies, going to major review outlets, independent booksellers, influential booktubers and booktokers, and select journalists. I added 3 names to that list. Morrison would like to send personal copies to these individuals, I told Elena through Margaret. They're people who will appreciate the themes of the book. The 3 names were Marcus Chen, Catherine Chen, and Linda Bradford. Elena hadn't questioned it. Authors sometimes sent ARCs to specific individuals, fellow writers, friends, people who'd influenced the work. Morrison's request seemed reasonable. The copies went out with a note I'd carefully crafted. I've been following your work with great interest. This novel explores themes I thought you might appreciate: family loyalty, corporate ethics, and the price of ambition. I hope you enjoy it. Best regards, V.L. Morrison. Generic enough to be meaningless, but I wanted them to have the book early. I wanted them to read it before it became a phenomenon. I wanted to see their faces. Well, I wouldn't literally see them, but I could imagine when they realized what was about to happen. Marcus called me 2 days after receiving his copy. Vera, have you seen this book? I'd been ready for this. What book? It's called The Inheritance. Some mystery writer sent me a copy. And Vera, it's about us, or someone like us. The husband embezzling from a pharmaceutical company, the daughter he marries, the stepsister who's in on it. It's too similar to be coincidence. I kept my voice calm. That does sound similar. But pharmaceutical company fraud isn't exactly rare. Maybe the author was inspired by multiple cases? The details, Vera, the specific methods, the shell companies, even some of the dialogue, it's like someone was watching us. Watching you do what, Marcus? I let the question hang. If the book is about corporate fraud and you're worried it seems similar to your situation, maybe that says more about your situation than about the book? He'd fallen silent. Then, I need to go, man. He'd hung up without saying goodbye. Catherine had called an hour later, hysterical. Did you write this? Did you fucking write this book? I signed an NDA, Catherine. Remember? Vera Chen cannot publish information about you or Marcus or the company. Are you suggesting I violated our agreement? Don't play games. This book, it's you. It has to be you. The book is by V.L. Morrison. You can check. Morrison's a mystery writer who published in the early 2000s. Long before I even met Marcus. I think you're being paranoid. The NDA is ironclad, I'd said sweetly. Vera Chen is bound to silence. If you think V.L. Morrison violated any agreement, you'd need to prove that Vera Chen and V.L. Morrison are the same person, which would be quite difficult given that Morrison is a pen name established 20 years before the events you're worried about. She'd been breathing hard on the other end of the line. You bitch. I'm going to hang up now, Catherine. And I'd suggest you be very careful about making accusations. If you start claiming this book is about you, you're essentially admitting to the crimes it describes. That would be unwise. I disconnected and blocked her number. The trap was set. They knew what was coming, but there was nothing they could do. They couldn't sue. That would require admitting the book was about them. They couldn't publicly deny the events. No one had accused them of anything yet. They couldn't stop publication. They had no standing to do so. All they could do was wait for the bomb to drop. The Inheritance released on a Tuesday in March. The publisher had timed it carefully, midweek, mid-month, no major competing releases. Elena wanted the book to have room to breathe, to find its audience organically. She needn't have worried. By Tuesday afternoon, the book was number 3 on Amazon. By Wednesday morning, it was 1-1. The initial sales were strong. Morrison's return after 20 years, combined with strong reviews from the ARCs, had created genuine buzz. Readers loved a good corporate thriller, and early word was that The Inheritance was exceptional. But then people started actually reading it, and they started talking. The first post that went viral came from a Book Talk user with 200,000 followers. Guys, I'm reading The Inheritance, and I'm pretty sure this is about the Chen Bradford pharma scandal, like the one where the daughter's husband embezzled. The details are too specific. Her video got 50,000 likes in 3 hours. Then came Twitter. Hold up, is The Inheritance literally just the Chen Bradford case in novel form? The pharmaceutical company, the dead father, the sketchy husband and stepsister? Someone investigate this. That tweet got 100,000 retweets. Then a Reddit thread. The Inheritance by V.L. Morrison, corporate thriller or true crime. The thread exploded. Amateur sleuths started comparing the book to real events. Someone found an old news article about Chen Bradford Pharma's internal restructuring and noted the timing matched the book. Someone else found my father's obituary and pointed out the family structure aligned with the fictional family. But the book says the embezzlement was fake, that the daughter was framed. The Chen case doesn't mention that. Yet. Maybe it's still under investigation. Maybe the real fraud is being covered up. Or maybe it's just fiction inspired by real events. The transaction numbers in Chapter 7, has anyone checked if they're real? Someone had. A financial analyst on Twitter ran the numbers through various databases and found they corresponded to real shell companies. Shell companies that had been flagged but never investigated because there'd been no complaint. Holy shit, The Inheritance isn't fiction, it's a confession. That's when the journalists got involved. Samantha Cho from the Boston Herald was the first to publish a piece. Local thriller appears to mirror Chen Bradford pharmaceutical scandal, but which version is true? Her article was careful, legally vetted, but pointed. She outlined the similarities between the book and real events. She noted that the book suggested the official story, Vera Chen embezzling, was actually a cover-up. She quoted anonymous sources suggesting there had always been questions about the Chen Bradford case. And she asked the question that would define the next 6 months. If V.L. Morrison is writing fiction, why does it align so perfectly with facts? And if Morrison is writing truth, who is Morrison? The article was shared 50,000 times in the first day. Other journalists followed. The New York Times ran a piece. The Inheritance, when corporate thriller becomes corporate evidence. The Wall Street Journal, pharmaceutical drama, fiction or fraud. Forbes, Chen Bradford Pharma under scrutiny after novel suggests embezzlement was cover-up. Every major outlet picked up the story. The book went from bestseller to cultural phenomenon. Everyone was reading it, analyzing it, debating it, and as people read, they started finding more evidence. Transaction numbers that matched real accounts, dates that aligned with actual board meetings, descriptions of documents that really existed. The book was a roadmap, and readers were following it straight to proof of massive corporate fraud. My anonymous Twitter account, @CorporateWatchdog, started posting again. For everyone asking about The Inheritance, here's how to verify if those transaction numbers are real. Thread with detailed instructions. My blog posted an article, The Inheritance and Corporate Fraud, a case study in how fiction reveals truth. I was fanning the flames, but carefully. Always anonymous, always framed as curiosity rather than accusation. Just a concerned citizen who happened to understand corporate fraud very well. The social media momentum was unstoppable. The inheritance trended for 3 straight days. Chen Bradford Farm trended alongside it. Conspiracy theories flourished. Internet sleuths dove into public records. And then, inevitably, people started asking, who is V.L. Morrison? The publisher had been careful to maintain Morrison's privacy, but internet detectives are relentless. Someone found the original V.L. Morrison books from the early 2000s. Someone else found my mother's obituary and noted that Lydia Bradford had been born in 1968, making her exactly the right age to have been writing in the 2000s. Wait, was Vera Chen's mother a mystery writer? Holy shit, is Vera Chen Morrison? The NDA, she can't talk about the fraud, so she wrote a book instead. The theory exploded. It made too much sense. The daughter of a mystery writer, silenced by an NDA, using her mother's pen name to expose the truth through fiction. But no one could prove it. The literary trust that held the Morrison pen name was private. My mother had set it up to be anonymous. No public records connecting V.L. Morrison to Lydia Bradford. Margaret Rothstein, as the trust attorney, refused all interview requests. The publisher claimed not to know Morrison's real identity. Their contract was with the trust, not an individual. I stayed silent. Vera Chen hadn't violated the NDA. Vera Chen had made no statements, published nothing, disclosed nothing. The ambiguity made it better. People debated whether I was Morrison, which kept the story alive. Every think piece about the book mentioned the mystery author. Every news segment included speculation about Morrison's identity. The book sold 2 million copies in the first month. But sales weren't the point. The point was what happened next. 2 weeks after publication, the SEC announced an investigation into Chen Bradford Pharmaceutical Corporation. The press release was brief. Following concerns raised by public allegations of financial impropriety, the Securities and Exchange Commission is reviewing the financial records of Chen Bradford Pharmaceutical Corporation. The company is cooperating fully with the investigation. The public allegations were the book. The inheritance had forced their hand. Once the book went viral, the SEC couldn't ignore it. Too many people were asking questions. Too many details were too specific. Even if the book was fiction, it warranted a look at the real company. And once they looked, they found everything. Because the book was a roadmap. Every fictional transaction in the novel corresponded to a real transaction, with just enough detail changed to be fictional, but enough accuracy to point investigators to the real records. The shell companies, the forged documents, the offshore accounts, all of it was real, just hidden. All of it was findable if you knew where to look. And the inheritance told them exactly where to look. The FBI opened a criminal investigation a week later. Fraud, embezzlement, forgery, conspiracy. They raided Chen Bradford Pharma offices with warrants. They seized financial records, computers, personal devices. They interviewed employees, board members, anyone who might have information. Marcus and Catherine lawyered up immediately. They released a joint statement calling the investigation a witch hunt, inspired by a work of malicious fiction. They insisted they'd been responsible stewards of the company. They hinted that Vera Chen, clearly unstable and seeking revenge, was behind the book. But they couldn't prove it. They threatened to sue me for violating the NDA, but their lawyers told them it was pointless. Vera Chen hadn't violated anything. V.L. Morrison had published a book, and there was no legal connection between Morrison and me. They tried to sue the publisher for defamation. The publisher's lawyers shut that down immediately. Our client published a work of fiction. If Mr. Chen and Ms. Chen believe the fictional characters defame them, they would need to prove the characters are of and concerning them. That would require admitting they are the real-life basis for characters who commit fraud and attempted murder. We strongly advise against that course of action. Marcus and Catherine had walked into exactly the trap I'd set. They couldn't fight the book without admitting it was about them. And admitting it was about them meant admitting to the crimes it described. They were trapped. The investigation took 4 months. In that time, I watched from a distance as their lives unraveled. The companies stock tanked. Major investors pulled out. Pharmaceutical contracts were canceled. Employees started resigning, not wanting to be associated with the scandal. Marcus and Catherine's social standing collapsed. The charity galas stopped inviting them. Country clubs revoked memberships. Former friends stopped returning calls. Boston society, which had embraced them as the new power couple, now treated them as pariahs. They tried to blame me publicly. Marcus gave an interview to a sympathetic journalist portraying himself as a victim of his vindictive ex-wife. Vera couldn't accept that I'd moved on with Catherine. She created this elaborate fantasy in a book to destroy us. But it's fiction. None of it is real. The interview backfired spectacularly, because while he was claiming it was all fiction, the FBI was simultaneously leaking that they'd found real evidence of fraud. Marcus looked like a liar, which, of course, he was. Catherine tried a different approach. She gave a tearful interview claiming she'd been manipulated by Marcus. I was young. I was naive. I trusted him. He told me what to do, and I didn't question it. I'm a victim here, too. But the evidence showed otherwise. Emails proved Catherine had been the architect of much of the fraud. The signature forgeries were in her handwriting. Her fingerprints were on the fake documents. She wasn't a victim, she was a co-conspirator. Linda, my stepmother, cut a deal early. She agreed to testify in exchange for immunity. Her testimony was damning. She'd known about the affair, known about the embezzlement, known about the plans to have me declared incompetent. She'd said nothing because she was financially dependent on Catherine and didn't want to lose her comfortable life. I was a coward, she admitted in her deposition. I watched them destroy Vera and I did nothing. I'll have to live with that. I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. But she'd had choices, and she'd chosen wrong. The indictments came down in July. Marcus, 14 counts of fraud, embezzlement, conspiracy, attempted murder. Catherine, 12 counts of fraud, forgery, conspiracy. Dr. Harrison Weiss, the psychiatrist, 3 counts of fraud related to his false diagnosis and bribery. Richard Davidson, their lawyer, 2 counts of conspiracy and obstruction. 3 board members who'd been complicit, various charges. The attempted murder charge came from the security footage of Marcus loosening the carpet. Prosecutors argued it was attempted manslaughter. He'd intended to cause my death, and only my caution had prevented it. His lawyers argued there was no proof he'd intended to kill me, that at most he'd endangered me recklessly. It didn't matter. Attempted murder or reckless endangerment, the charge made clear what kind of man he was. The trial started in October, 8 months after the inheritance had published. It was a media circus, cameras outside the courthouse every day, reporters shouting questions at Marcus and Catherine as they entered, court sketch artists capturing every moment for the evening news. I didn't attend. I couldn't. My presence would have been inflammatory, and the prosecutors wanted the focus on the evidence, not on me. But I watched every day from my apartment, live streams running on my laptop. The prosecution's case was methodical. They walked the jury through years of fraud, showing exactly how Marcus and Catherine had stolen from the company. They presented the shell companies, the forged documents, the offshore accounts. They showed the emails, the text messages, the signal chats. They explained how Marcus had manipulated my father, isolating me during his final illness, how Catherine had forged my signature to make it look like I was the embezzler, how Dr. Weiss had been paid to diagnose me as paranoid and unstable. And they presented the security footage of Marcus loosening the carpet, explaining that in Vera Chen's previous life, before the investigation had begun, she'd been too afraid to come forward with this evidence, fearing she wouldn't be believed. But now, with the full weight of federal law enforcement behind the investigation, the truth could finally be told. It was a clever framing. The previous life phrasing made it sound metaphorical. Before the investigation, Vera had been powerless. Now she was empowered. The jury didn't need to know about my actual rebirth. They just needed to understand that I'd been too scared to fight openly until I'd found another way. The defense tried to argue that the inheritance had tainted the jury pool, that the entire trial was the result of a malicious book by a vindictive ex-wife. They called the investigation fruit of the poisonous tree, triggered by a biased source. The judge shut that down. V.L. Morrison is not on trial. Morrison published a legal work of fiction. That work happened to inspire legitimate investigation by federal authorities. The evidence presented here was obtained through proper legal channels, not from the book. If the book pointed investigators toward evidence, that doesn't make the evidence inadmissible. It makes the book good research. The defense called their own experts, forensic accountants who tried to explain away the shell companies as legitimate business structures, psychiatrists who suggested I might actually be unstable, creating elaborate revenge fantasies, Character witnesses who claimed Marcus and Catherine were good people, but the prosecution's evidence was overwhelming. Transaction records, emails, forged documents, testimony from Grace Lynn and Linda Bradford and a dozen other witnesses. The defense couldn't explain it away, and hanging over everything was the book. The jury had been instructed not to read the inheritance, but everyone knew they had. How could they not? The book that had started it all, the novel that had exposed everything. Even if they couldn't officially use it as evidence, it framed their understanding of the case. The jury deliberated for 3 days. When they came back, the verdict was unanimous, guilty on all counts. Marcus Chen was sentenced to 18 years in federal prison. Catherine Chen was sentenced to 15 years. Dr. Weiss got 7 years. Davidson lost his law license and got 3 years. The board members got probation and massive fines. Chen Bradford Pharmaceutical Corporation was dissolved. The company my father had built was gone, but at least his name was cleared. The official record now stated that Vera Chen had been the victim of fraud, not the perpetrator. My father's legacy was restored. I watched the sentencing from my apartment, alone, tears streaming down my face. Not from sadness, from relief, from the overwhelming sense that justice had finally been served. Marcus's face when the judge read the sentence. I'd remember that forever. The shock, the disbelief, the dawning realization that he'd actually lost. That the woman he'd underestimated had destroyed him. Catherine had sobbed. She'd begged for mercy, claiming she'd been manipulated, that she'd made mistakes but didn't deserve 15 years. The judge had been unmoved. You didn't just steal money, he'd said. You stole a daughter's relationship with her dying father. You attempted to have an innocent woman declared insane. You tried to destroy someone's life for profit. 15 years is lenient. After the sentencing, I received a letter from Marcus. It was forwarded through my lawyer. We had no direct contact, per the terms of the divorce I'd filed while he was awaiting trial. The envelope was worn, the paper inside creased from multiple readings, as if he'd written and rewritten it many times. Vera, it began, I know you probably won't read this. I know I have no right to ask for anything from you, but I'm writing anyway because I need to say it. I'm sorry. I know that doesn't fix anything. I know it doesn't give you back the years I stole or the company we destroyed or the father you lost while I was poisoning his final months. But I'm sorry. I've had a lot of time to think in here about what I did, about who I became, about how I convinced myself that you were the problem, when really, I was just a mediocre man who married above his station and couldn't handle it. You were always smarter than me, always better than me. I knew it, deep down, and I hated you for it. So I tried to drag you down to my level. Catherine helped, but it was my idea, my plan, my ambition that turned toxic because I couldn't achieve what I wanted through actual merit. I know about Morrison. I mean, I can't prove it, but I know the writing style matches some essays you wrote in college before we met. The way she structures reveals it's how you used to explain complex problems, building up the evidence piece by piece until the conclusion was undeniable. It's brilliant. I hate that it destroyed me, but I can acknowledge that it's brilliant. You used our arrogance against us. You let us think we'd won, and in our celebration, we never noticed you were setting the trap. The NDA that was supposed to silence you became the proof that you'd honored your agreements while still seeking justice. I don't expect forgiveness. I don't expect a response. I just wanted you to know that I finally understand what I did to you. And if I could go back, I'd be the man you deserved instead of the man I was. But I can't go back. Neither of us can. So I hope you're happy. I hope you found someone who treats you the way I should have. I hope you're writing stories that don't have to be about revenge. And I hope someday you can remember the early days when I loved you, really loved you, before the ambition and the jealousy poisoned everything, without it hurting too much. I'm sorry, Vera, for all of it. Marcus, I read the letter 3 times. Then I filed it away in a folder marked research. Because someday, maybe I might write about a villain who finally understood what he'd done, about the psychology of a man who destroyed something beautiful because he couldn't stand that it made him feel small. But not yet. The Inheritance spent 43 weeks on the New York Times bestseller list. It sold 6 million copies worldwide. It was translated into 37 languages. A limited series was optioned by a major streaming service. with an A-list actress attached to play Victoria Sterling. V.L. Morrison became a cultural phenomenon. Think pieces in literary journals debated whether autofiction was an appropriate term for work that so closely mirrored real events. Law review articles discussed whether fiction could serve as evidence. Business schools taught the book as a case study in corporate fraud, and everyone wanted to know, who is V.L. Morrison? The speculation never stopped. Reddit threads, true crime podcasts, investigative journalists, everyone had theories. The connection to my mother was discovered early, but no one could prove I was Morrison. The Literary Trust maintained its privacy. Margaret Rothstein refused all interviews. The publisher stuck to their story that they didn't know Morrison's real identity. I gave exactly one interview 3 years after the trial ended. A journalist from The New Yorker tracked me down through a mutual contact and asked, point blank, for the truth. I agreed to talk, but only on my terms. No recording, no photographs, and final approval on all quotes. The journalist, Sarah Jennings, agreed. We met at a cafe in Portland, Oregon, where I'd moved after the trial ended. I'd wanted distance from Boston, from the memories, from the life I'd lived with Marcus. Portland was rainy and green and anonymous, perfect for starting over. Are you V.L. Morrison? Sarah asked immediately. I smiled. Vera Chen signed a very specific non-disclosure agreement. That agreement prevented Vera Chen from speaking about certain matters. It's a legally binding document, and Vera Chen has never violated it. That's not a denial. No, I agreed, it's not. Sarah leaned forward, her notebook open. How did you know they wouldn't figure it out, that they'd make the NDA so specific? Because they thought they were smarter than me, I said simply. They thought I was broken. They thought specificity meant security. If they bound Vera Chen thoroughly enough, they'd be safe. They never considered that I might not use that name. That's brilliant. That's revenge, I corrected. Brilliance would have been preventing them from destroying my father's company in the first place. Revenge is making sure they paid for it in the most ironic way possible, by giving them exactly what they asked for. And you're not concerned about admitting this now? The statute of limitations on the NDA? The statute of limitations has passed. And even if it hadn't, what would they do? Sue me? They're in federal prison. They have no money, no power, no standing. And Vera Chen technically still hasn't violated the NDA. Vera Chen isn't making any statements. Vera Bradford, my current legal name after the divorce, is having a conversation with a journalist. That's different. Sarah had laughed. You really did think of everything. I had to. I'd already lost once. I wasn't going to lose again. Lost? I don't understand. And I'd told her. Not everything, not the literal rebirth. That would sound insane. But I told her about how, in another life, I'd tried to fight Marcus and Catherine openly. How I'd accused them and been called crazy. How I'd presented evidence and been dismissed. How they'd managed to have me declared incompetent, and I'd died before I could clear my name. I framed it metaphorically. I died in that first fight. Not literally, but emotionally, professionally, spiritually. Everything I was died when they destroyed my credibility. So when I got a second chance, when I realized I needed to fight smarter, not harder, I approached it completely differently. It was close enough to the truth. Sarah's article ran with the headline, "The Woman Who Wrote Her Own Justice: How Vera Bradford Used Her Mother's Pen Name to Expose Corporate Fraud." In the piece, I was careful. I never explicitly said, I am V.L. Morrison. I spoke around it, letting readers draw their own conclusions. The ambiguity was intentional. Let people believe what they wanted. The mystery was part of the legend now. The article went viral. It was shared millions of times, discussed endlessly. People debated whether I'd admitted to being Morrison or just strongly implied it. Legal experts weighed in on whether my statements could constitute a violation of the NDA, but nothing happened. Marcus and Catherine in prison had no recourse. The NDA was with Vera Chen, and Vera Chen no longer legally existed. I'd changed my name back to Bradford after the divorce. And even if they'd tried to argue, otherwise, the statute of limitations had long since passed. I was safe. And more importantly, I was free. 5 years after The Inheritance published, I released the sequel. The Inheritance Aftermath detailed what had happened after Victoria Sterling had exposed her husband and stepsister. It included the investigation, the trial, the aftermath, and the rebuilding of Victoria's life. It also included chapters from the antagonist's perspectives: Michael and Christine's life in prison, their regrets, their slow realization of how thoroughly they'd destroyed themselves. I'd interviewed Marcus and Catherine for the book. Not as Vera Bradford, they'd refused to see me. But V.L. Morrison could send questions through a journalist who was writing a feature on life after white-collar crime. Both Marcus and Catherine, desperate for any kind of platform or relevance, had answered questions. They still didn't know for certain I was Morrison. Or maybe they did and couldn't bring themselves to admit it. Either way, their answers gave me everything I needed. Marcus had written, "I think about the NDA every day. I thought I was being so clever, making it so specific. But she found the loophole. She was always smarter than I gave her credit for. That was my biggest mistake, underestimating her." Catherine had written, "If I could go back, I'd never have agreed to make it about Vera Chen specifically. Our lawyer suggested it. He thought it made it more enforceable. Instead, it made it useless. She technically never violated it. She destroyed us while honoring it to the letter. I hate that I almost admire that." I included both quotes in the book attributed to the fictional villains Michael and Christine. Critics called it a stunning meditation on hubris and consequences. They praised the sequel as even better than the original, noting the psychological depth of the antagonist's perspectives. The sequel debuted at #1 on the bestseller list. I wrote it not just for catharsis, but to close the chapter, to show that the bad guys don't get redemption arcs in real life. They sit in prison, reflecting on their mistakes, but they don't get to rebuild or start over. They pay for what they've done. And Victoria Sterling, or Vera Bradford, or whoever she was, she got to move on. It's been 10 years now since I woke up 6 months in the past, given an impossible second chance. I'm sitting in my study in the house I bought with the book proceeds. It's not a mansion like I grew up in, but it's mine in a way that place never was. Every piece of furniture I chose, every book on these shelves I selected, every decision about paint color and garden layout and which room would be the office, all mine. My mother's original V.L. Morrison books have a place of honor on the shelf behind my desk. Next to them are the additions, The Inheritance Aftermath, and 5 more novels I've written since. Morrison's comeback has been, critically, acclaimed and commercially successful. I've expanded beyond revenge thrillers. I've written a romance, a story about second chances and learning to trust again after betrayal. I've written a mystery about a cold case investigator. I've written a psychological thriller that has nothing to do with my own life, but I've also written another corporate fraud novel, this one about big oil and climate change, and one about tech company fraud, and one about hospital systems that prioritize profit over patient care. Morrison has become known for taking on institutional corruption, for telling stories about powerful people who think they're untouchable. Every book sells well. Every book inspires conversations about corporate ethics and accountability. And every book makes me think about how one person with the right tools, truth, evidence, and a platform can change things. I met someone 3 years ago. Daniel, a literature professor who teaches mystery fiction at Portland State. We met at a bookstore event, not for Morrison, for another author, and bonded over our mutual love of classic mysteries. He doesn't know I'm Morrison, not for certain. He suspects, I think. There are too many coincidences, my mother being Lydia Bradford, my connections to the pharmaceutical fraud case, the way I sometimes talk about the books with insider knowledge. But he's never asked directly, and I've never confirmed. Maybe someday I'll tell him. Maybe not. Some mysteries are better left unsolved. We're happy together. He treats me the way Marcus never did, with respect, equality, genuine affection. We have a partnership, not a power dynamic. And that feels like its own kind of revenge. Living well, being happy, proving that I didn't need Marcus's destruction to define me. Though honestly, destroying him was pretty satisfying too. Sometimes people ask me if I ever regret it. If I wish I'd confronted Marcus and Catherine directly instead of through a book. If I wish I'd found a way to save the company instead of just exposing its corruption. I tell them the truth. I'm not sorry. In my first life, I'd tried the direct approach. I'd screamed the truth and been called crazy. I'd gathered evidence and watched it be dismissed. I'd fought openly and been destroyed. In my second life, I'd learned. I'd understood that sometimes the best revenge isn't confrontation. It's making your enemies think they've won while you're actually handing them the rope they'll hang themselves with. The NDA had been their idea. The specific wording had been their choice. They'd been so focused on silencing Vera Chen that they'd never considered she might have another voice. That was their failure, not mine. And when they'd signed that agreement, triple-checking that every clause bound Vera Chen specifically, they'd been so satisfied. So certain they'd outmaneuvered me. So confident that their legal expertise had guaranteed their safety. They'd never asked the one question. That would have saved them. Who is V.L. Morrison? By the time they figured it out, it was too late. The book was published, the investigations were launched, the evidence was public. And Vera Chen? Vera Chen had never said a word. She didn't need to. Morrison had said it all for her. On the 10th anniversary of my rebirth, the day I'd woken up 6 months in the past, confused and terrified and determined not to die again, I visit my father's grave. I bring flowers, like I do every year. White lilies, his favorite. I bring my mother's original V.L. Morrison books, stacked carefully. And I bring a hardcover first edition of The Inheritance, the book that changed everything. I did it, Dad, I say softly, kneeling beside the headstone. I saved your company's reputation. I exposed the people who betrayed you. I made sure your life's work wasn't remembered as a fraud factory. The wind rustles through the cemetery trees. It's a beautiful day, sunny and warm, the kind of day my father would have loved. And I did it by being smarter than they ever thought I could be. You always said Mom was the clever one, that she could have run the company if she'd wanted to, but she preferred to build worlds with words instead. I trace my fingers over the book cover, feeling the embossed title. I guess I'm both of you. Your determination, her creativity, your company, her pen name. My father had been a good man, ethical to his core. He'd built Chen Bradford Pharma on principles, quality over profit, safety over speed, integrity over shortcuts. If he'd lived to see what Marcus and Catherine had done to his company, it would have broken his heart. But he never had to see it. He died believing his legacy was secure, his daughter would carry on, his son-in-law was trustworthy. Maybe that ignorance had been a mercy. I hope you're both proud, I say, looking at both my parents' graves. My mother is buried beside my father, their headstones matching granite. I know the company's gone, but its legacy is clean. No one remembers Bradford Pharma as corrupt. They remember it as the victim of embezzlement, restored by the founder's daughter who refused to let the truth stay hidden. I stand, brushing grass from my knees. The cemetery is empty today, except for me. Private, quiet, peaceful. I'm writing something different now, I tell them. Not revenge, something about hope, about second chances, about finding love after betrayal. My phone buzzes with a text from Daniel. Dinner at 7? I'm making pasta. I smile. Simple domestic happiness. The kind of thing I'd never had with Marcus, who'd always been performing, calculating, angling. I met someone, I tell my parents. He's good. He's kind. He makes me laugh. I think you'd like him, Dad. And Mom, he teaches mystery fiction. He loves your books. Another gust of wind, stronger this time. I'm going to tell him, I decide out loud. About Morrison, about everything. He deserves to know who he's with. And I think I'm ready to share that secret. It feels right. 10 years of carrying this alone, of maintaining the mystery, of protecting myself through anonymity. But Daniel has proven himself. He loves me for who I am, not what I can give him. He deserves the truth. I leave the books by my parents' headstones, all 8 V.L. Morrison novels, a complete collection from mother to daughter. Someone will probably steal them eventually, but that's okay. Books are meant to be read, stories are meant to be shared. I walk back to my car, pulling out my phone. I text Daniel back. 7 is perfect, and I need to tell you something important. His response? Mysterious. Can't wait. I drive home through Portland's green streets thinking about the story I'm about to tell, not the Morrison reveal, though that too, but the bigger story, the one about rebirth and revenge and writing your own justice. Maybe someday I'll write that story, not as Morrison, but as myself. Vera Bradford, a memoir, or something equally straightforward. The story of a woman who died, came back, and destroyed the people who'd killed her. People would think it was metaphorical, a spiritual rebirth, not a literal one, and that would be fine. The truth doesn't always need to be believed to be true. That night, over Daniel's homemade pasta, I tell him everything. About Marcus and Catherine, about my father's death and the embezzlement and the NDA, about my mother's pen name and the literary trust, about writing the inheritance and watching it destroy the people who'd tried to destroy me. I'm V.L. Morrison, I say finally. I wrote the book that started the investigation. I used the NDA against them by publishing under a name they'd never thought to prohibit. Daniel sets down his wine glass slowly. He's quiet for a long moment, processing. Then he smiles. I know. You know? I've known for a while. Since we visited your parents' graves the first time and you mentioned your mother being a writer, I did the math. Lydia Bradford, mystery writer from the early 2000s. V.L. Morrison, mystery writer who disappeared in 2008. The timing, the connection to the pharmaceutical fraud case. It wasn't hard to figure out. I'm stunned. And you never said anything? I figured you'd tell me when you were ready. You clearly had reasons for maintaining the secret. I wasn't going to push. Doesn't it bother you that I lied? You didn't lie. You just didn't confirm, and honestly? He reaches across the table to take my hand. I think it's incredible. What you did, using their own weapons against them, finding a legal way to expose the truth, making them pay for what they'd done. That took courage and brilliance and a kind of poetic justice that most people only dream about. I feel tears prickling at my eyes. You're not disturbed that I orchestrated their downfall so carefully? They tried to have you killed, Vera. They stole from you, gaslit you, tried to destroy your mind and your reputation. You didn't hurt anyone who didn't deserve it. You exposed criminals and cleared your father's name. That's not disturbing. That's justice. We sit in silence for a moment, hands linked across the table. So, Daniel says eventually, what are you working on now? Another Morrison thriller? Actually, thought I say someone to miss. I'm thinking about something different. A memoir, maybe? Or autobiographical fiction. The story of what really happened. People will think you're exaggerating. Probably, but maybe that's the point. The truth is so wild that it sounds like fiction. But fiction can contain truth that facts alone can't express. Daniel grins. Very meta. Morrison would approve. Morrison does approve, I say, grinning back. She's me. Can I read it when it's done? You'll be the first. I write the memoir over the next 2 years. It's a harder book than any of the thrillers because it requires vulnerability instead of calculation. I have to admit to my own mistakes, my own moments of fear and doubt. I have to show the woman I was before I became the woman who destroyed her enemies. I title it After Rebirth because that's what it is, the story of what came after I died and came back, the story of revenge and justice and finding yourself after you've been destroyed. I publish it under my own name, Vera Bradford. The book becomes a phenomenon in a different way than the Morrison thrillers. It's a memoir/manifesto about survival, about fighting back, about refusing to stay silent even when silence is enforced. Women, especially, respond to it. Women who've been gaslighted, abused, silenced. Women who've been told they're crazy when they speak their truth. The book gives them permission to fight back, to be angry, to seek justice even when the system tells them to let it go. I do a book tour this time, the first time V.L. Morrison or Vera Bradford or whoever I am has done public appearances. I talk about the NDA, about finding loopholes, about using creativity as a weapon. I encourage people to document everything, to trust their own perceptions, to never let anyone gaslight them into silence. At every event, someone asks, "Do you regret any of it?" And I always give the same answer: I regret that it was necessary. I don't regret that I did it. Marcus got early release after 12 years. Good behavior, model prisoner, all that. He's out now, living in a halfway house in Michigan, working at a grocery store. I know because he sent me a letter. Not through lawyers this time, directly to my publisher, who forwarded it. "I read your memoir," he wrote, "all of it. You were right about everything. I was a mediocre man who couldn't handle being married to someone extraordinary. I destroyed something beautiful because I couldn't stand feeling small. I don't expect forgiveness, I don't deserve it, but I wanted you to know that I understand what I was, and I'm trying to be better. Probably too late, definitely too little, but trying. I'm glad you're happy. I'm glad you found someone who deserves you. I'm glad you wrote the story you needed to write. And I'm sorry for all of it. For the rest of my life, I'm sorry. Marcus." I put the letter in a drawer, not filed away for research this time, just set aside, acknowledged and released. Catherine is still in prison. She has 3 more years. She's never written to me, never acknowledged what she did. Some people never learn. I'm writing this now, 15 years after my rebirth from my study in Portland. The house is full of life now. Daniel and I got married 5 years ago, a small ceremony in the backyard. We have a daughter, Lydia, named after my mother. She's 3 years old and already obsessed with books. Sometimes I wonder if she'll be a writer too, if the Morrison legacy will pass to her. But I don't pressure her. Whatever she wants to be, she'll be. With parents who support her, not destroy her. My mother's original V.L. Morrison books still have a place of honor on my shelf. Next to them are the 13 novels I've written since, 7 under Morrison, 6 under my own name. I'm working on number 14 now, another corporate thriller about a whistleblower who brings down a tech company. The @Corporate Watchdog Twitter account is still active. Still anonymous, still educating people about fraud and how to fight it. I've expanded to other platforms, TikTok, Instagram, YouTube, reaching younger audiences, teaching them to be vigilant, to document, to trust their instincts. I get messages constantly from people who say I saved them, women who documented their partner's abuse and used it to escape, employees who uncovered fraud at their companies and reported it, people who trusted themselves instead of letting others manipulate them. That's the real legacy, I think. Not the books, though those matter. Not the money, though that helped rebuild my life. The legacy is showing people that you can fight back, that you can win, that silence isn't the only option when someone tries to silence you. Last week, a law student reached out asking if she could write her thesis about my case, specifically about the intersection of NDAs and freedom of speech, using V.L. Morrison's work as a case study. "Your case changed how courts think about gag orders," she wrote. "You proved that you can honor the letter of an agreement while still pursuing justice through other means. That's been cited in 17 cases since your trial." 17 cases. 17 times my strategy has been used by others to fight back against unjust silencing. That makes it all worth it. Sometimes, late at night, I think about that other life, the one where I died on the stairs, the one where Marcus and Catherine won. I think about what would have happened if I hadn't gotten that second chance. If I'd stayed dead instead of waking up 6 months in the bed's past. They would have inherited everything. They would have restructured the company into something unrecognizable. They would have spent their lives thinking they were clever, thinking they'd gotten away with it. My father's legacy would have died with me. But I did get a second chance. Through some impossible miracle, reincarnation, quantum mechanics, a glitch in the universe I'll never know, I got to come back and fix it. And I did. I destroyed the people who killed me. I restored my father's reputation. I protected my mother's legacy. I built a new life on my own terms. I wrote my own story, literally, and now I'm teaching others to write theirs. On the 15th anniversary of my rebirth, though no one but me knows that's what it is, I go back to Boston, back to the cemetery where my parents are buried. The graves are well maintained. Someone's been leaving flowers regularly, probably Grace Lynn, my father's former assistant, who now runs a nonprofit for whistleblowers. We've stayed in touch over the years. She named her organization the Bradford Foundation in honor of my father's ethics. I bring new copies of all my books, both the Morrison thrillers and the Vera Bradford memoirs and novels. A complete collection. I stack them between my parents' headstones. I did it, I tell them. Everything I set out to do. Justice, truth, freedom. The wind picks up, rustling through the old oak trees. And I'm happy, really truly happy. Not just because I won, though that helps, but because I'm living the life I want. Writing the stories I want to write. Loving someone who loves me back. Raising a daughter who'll never doubt herself the way I was made to doubt myself. I sit on the grass between the graves, something I never would have done at 22. The girl I was before Marcus, before the betrayal, before the death and rebirth, she would have been too worried about grass stains, too concerned with appearances. But I'm not that girl anymore. I'm the woman who died and came back. The woman who destroyed her enemies. The woman who wrote her own justice. Thank you, I say finally. Thank you for the gifts you gave me. Dad, your integrity. I used it as my compass. Mom, your creativity. I used it as my weapon. Together, you made me someone who could survive the worst and come out stronger. I stand, brushing off grass. The cemetery is peaceful, beautiful, a good place to rest. I'll keep writing, I promise. I'll keep fighting. I'll keep teaching people that silence isn't the only option. That's my legacy now. Not just the company, not just the books. The lesson that you can lose everything and still win in the end. As I walk back to my rental car, my phone buzzes. It's Daniel with a photo of Lydia. She's sitting in my study, surrounded by books, pretending to read one of my mother's old mysteries. The text says, like mother, like daughter, like grandmother. I smile. 3 generations of storytellers, 3 generations of women who refuse to be silenced. Lydia will never know what I went through to get here. She'll never need to. She'll grow up in a world where her mother is celebrated, not destroyed, where her voice matters from day one. That's the real victory. Not Marcus in prison, not Catherine paying for her crimes, not even the restored reputation of my family. The real victory is that my daughter will never have to write her way out of silence, because I already did. I drive away from the cemetery, leaving the books behind. Someone will find them, read them, maybe understand the full story, or maybe not. It doesn't matter anymore. The story is told, the justice is served, the silence is broken. And Vera Chen signed an NDA that bound her to silence. But V.L. Morrison spoke for her, and Vera Bradford lived the life they tried to steal. And that, in the end, is the only story that matters.